Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 3 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses gave up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format in order to give ourselves more perspective and insight as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After we talk about matchups, we'll then transition to our top 36 running back rankings, as I'll give you guys statistics in order to justify the reasons as to how I think the running back position is going to stack up when it's all said and done at the end of Week 3. Now, before we begin, I want to remind you, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are trying to get to our goal of 70,000 subscribers. Of course, we're making daily fantasy football content in order to help you win your weekly matchups and a fantasy football championship this year. So be sure to subscribe down below. Thank you very much. Also, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy for those of you who are trying to play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, whether it is draft or potential pick'ems. You can go ahead, check that out down in the description of the video. We have a link. If you use promo code Andrew when you sign up and make a first-time deposit via Underdog Fantasy, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So for those of you trying to take advantage of that and play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, especially when there's a Thursday night game or a Monday night game where the matchup doesn't have any of your players involved, you can create a pick'em slip, pick higher or lower on given statistics, and have some fun that way. So check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the running back conversation, beginning with matchups, like I mentioned. Of course, what you can see immediately to the right of me is statistics that defenses have given up to opposing running backs as of the last 2 weeks. Now, I've gone ahead and just isolated running backs. I don't really care how many points a fullback is going to gather within an offense. They're used more like tight ends. So what I've gone ahead and done is just isolated running back stats across the board in order to give ourselves more insight as to which defenses have ultimately been giving up a lot of points to the position. The Detroit Lions, Washington Commanders, Arizona Cardinals really have not been able to stop a nosebleed in that category, especially the Washington Commanders on the ground, giving up a boatload of yardage. Nonetheless, a lot of these statistics are going to kind of even themselves out as we progress throughout the weeks. Just giving you some perspective as to right now who's giving up the most points and which defenses have really been stout against, running backs. Denver Broncos, Los Angeles Rams, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Miami Dolphins, Buffalo Bills. Typically the top end defenses throughout the league over the last couple years are continuing to be in that same category. But if we go ahead and take it a step further and just isolate running back rushing stats allowed, because the data over the years has proven that receiving stats does not play a contributing factor in regards to matchups. If we only isolate rushing statistics alone, yardage and touchdowns, we've seen the Detroit Lions, Philadelphia Eagles, New York Jets have been the 3 worst teams in terms of giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average. While on the other end of the spectrum, we've seen Miami, New England, Jacksonville be absolutely incredible in that category. So this should give you some more perspective. We'll refer back to these statistics as we progress throughout today's video, talking about each single player. Again, like I typically do, I put a star designation on screen in order to give you some perspective as to what kind of a matchup we're expecting and how difficult or easy it is based on those stars. A 1-star matchup being something you want to avoid, and on the other end, a 5-star matchup being something that you want to go ahead, play your running back prospect against, and find a lot of success. We also have fantasy points allowed in terms of rushing stats, like we just mentioned. All right, so let's get into our top 36 running back conversation, beginning with Jonathan Taylor. Again, Jonathan Taylor is one of the best backs in the NFL, and even though he had a really unfortunate week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, I suppose the curse still exists. They have lost 8 consecutive years in Jacksonville, and really the offense looked awful. They only earned 9 first downs in that game. When I went back to 2021 and looked at the entire season spectrum, there were only 8 teams that ever had 10 or less first downs in a singular game throughout the entire 18-game season. So just putting into perspective just how bad they were. But listen, we're talking about Jonathan Taylor, one of the best backs in the league, a guy that has averaged 5.29 yards per carry throughout his entire career. Even last week was averaging 6.0 yards per carry against the Jacksonville Jaguars. But the passing game, their defense, nothing was able to really click throughout that contest. But going forward against the Kansas City Chiefs this upcoming week, I expect them to have a bounce back game. Jonathan Taylor should be perfectly fine. Moving on, let's talk about Saquon Barkley, our number 2, taking on the Dallas Cowboys. An exciting NFC East matchup between the 2-0 Giants and Dallas Cowboys. Who would have guessed that the Giants were going to be 2-0? But I digress. Let's talk about Saquon Barkley and how well he has played. I know he's coming off of a week in which he had a 10-point fantasy performance in a half PPR, and you may not be happy with that overall production. But again, he played 84% of the offensive snaps, got himself receiving work, and has been getting 24 touches per game over the last 2 games. As long as you're in that conversation of elite levels of opportunity, it doesn't matter which defense you find yourself up against, you're going to find success. I expect the New York Giants even though they're taking on a Dallas Cowboys defense that is pretty good in terms of stopping the run. To find success, Saquon Barkley just needs to find the end zone to be able to get into that upper echelon at the running back position, which we expect him to be in every single week. Moving on, let's talk about Dalvin Cook. I know last night's football game, the Eagles really did destroy the Minnesota Vikings. It was not even close, but I expect the Minnesota Vikings to have a bounce back week against a division rival like the Detroit Lions. Again, the Detroit Lions, like we've talked about, have given up the most points, or are in the category of giving up the most points to opposing running backs, whether it's on the ground, through the air, it does not matter. Detroit has not been able to stop the run over the last couple years, and we have seen even Minnesota Vikings running backs be able to take advantage of that. Last season, Dalvin Cook was injured in the 2 games that they took on the Detroit Lions. Alexander, in his place, came in, put up 19.9 fantasy points in one contest and 22.8 in the other. I understand that, Kirk Cousins wasn't able to really get anything going, turned over the ball a bunch, and that really caused him to have to drift away from running the ball. If you don't have the ability to threaten play action, the Philadelphia Eagles blitz them all night, and that is going to be the biggest difference maker. If they're able to establish a running game, their passing game will open up more. I expect Dalvin Cook to be reestablished this upcoming week. Moving on to Christian McCaffrey, taking on the New Orleans Saints. We all know that the New Orleans Saints defense overall, typically, unless they're playing against Cordero Patterson, are pretty stout in terms of the run stopping, defense that they have. Over the years, they've been fantastic. But the biggest difference maker as to why Christian McCaffrey has found success against that defense, regardless of the fact that that defense can stop the run, is his receiving work. From 2019 through 2021, he's averaged 23.77 fantasy points per game against his division rival, the New Orleans Saints. Now, as of this current moment in time, I still expect Christian McCaffrey to find himself being pretty successful this week, but we want to see more overall usage in the receiving game. He has only had 8 catches on 10 targets in the last 2 weeks. Those kind of numbers are not enough for Christian McCaffrey. He should be doing that in one singular game. In the last 3 games he played against New Orleans, he scored 4 touchdowns and has had 21 receptions. Unless he's going to be averaging that 1 touchdown, 7 reception kind of mark against New Orleans, it's going to be tough. So we're hoping he can get to that point. It's all up to Baker distributing the ball in his direction. Moving on to Joe Mixon, the thumbnail for today's video. It is a 5-star matchup. He's obviously in a fantastic position taking on the Jets. We just saw Nick Chubb destroy this defense. As of right now, besides the fact that Joe Mixon is continuing to average 20-plus touches per game, he's also on pace for meeting career highs in terms of targets and receptions as of just last week's performance. If he's able to just sustain the 4 targets, 3 receptions that he saw in week 2 throughout the course of the rest of the season, that's all we can ask for. We know Samaje Perine is going to be involved in this backfield, but he has been pretty heavily out-targeted in terms of the receiving work in this offense by Joe Mixon. If, in fact, we're getting Joe Mixon more involved, I think this is a matchup for the Cincinnati Bengals where they should be able to score, and that's been the biggest difference maker. In the last 2 weeks, they have only scored 3 offensive touchdowns. Now you get into a Jets matchup, in my opinion, a lot of touchdowns should be there, especially for Joe Mixon. Moving on to Nick Chubb. Speaking of, he takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers on Thursday night. It's a short week, and typically those games are really run-heavy and defensive-heavy. I expect Nick Chubb to be the entire focal point of that game, continuing to give this man the ball, coming off a 30-point fantasy performance against the New York Jets. And the biggest difference maker between Nick Chubb having a good week and a great week is specifically whether or not he scores a touchdown. Because in terms of backfield touches, thus far this season, Nick Chubb has had 43 and Kareem Hunt has had 30. They're pretty close in terms of overall touches in this backfield. Yet, the fact that he averages 5.1 yards per carry, he's able to sustain on a limited amount of touches in comparison to other running backs in the league who are splitting their respective backfield. But the fact that he had 3 rushing touchdowns against the Jets, fantastic. The number one stat that keeps me excited about Nick Chubb going forward is the fact that inside the 10-yard line, he has 5 rushing attempts, while Kareem Hunt only has 1 this season. That in itself gives me hope. Moving on, we have DeAndre Swift taking on the Minnesota Vikings. Listen, DeAndre Swift was hobbled this last week, and even though he still managed to find himself 15.7 fantasy points with the ankle injury and still being limited. The guy literally only had 5 rushing attempts, but still 56 rushing yards. A big run early in that game certainly helped him. Had 2 catches on 5 targets. Literally caught the ball, fell on the ground, got up, no one was around him, and ran into the end zone for 30 yards. An incredible performance. A lot of luck in those scenarios, but hey, he's a skillful running back, and behind a pretty beat up offensive line last week, was still able to find success playing 50% of the offensive snaps. Those numbers are all going to go up as he gets healthier, as the weeks progress, as his offensive linemen, who are the primary starters, return. I think he's in a good position to find success against Minnesota once again this week. Moving on, we have Austin Ekeler taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. I understand that Austin Ekeler's performances over the last couple weeks are seriously concerning. The fact that he has not had a goal line rushing attempt thus far this season is very concerning. They've given one to Sony Michel, and then their fullback has had 2 receiving touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. We do not know the current status of whether or not Justin Herbert is going to play. If he doesn't, that could very easily hurt the overall upside of Austin Ekeler, but you go back to last week's performance, he had 9 receptions. If he eventually gets into the position to accommodating his performance with a rushing touchdown, he's going to go back to being that 20-point guy every single week in fantasy. That's the expectation. That's the high watermark that he has set. It's just a matter of when we're going to get there, not if. Moving on, let's talk about our number 9. We have Derrick Henry. Now, I understand last night's performance was quite brutal. They got blown out. It is what it is. They're going to have to continue to get better as the weeks progress. Taylor Lewan went down with an injury. He was carted off. That is their primary starting left tackle. If he's not going to be there for them, that is a huge loss considering how many pieces they've already lost within this offensive line this offseason, which is certainly showing thus far. The running game has not found much success for Derrick Henry. He's had himself a couple exciting runs this season, but last night, none of that really existed against the Buffalo Bills. They really showed up and they showed out. Now he gets an opportunity to take on the Las Vegas Raiders. A 4-star matchup, in my opinion. They've given up their fair share of points to running backs. Again, last night's performance, isn't really indicative as to what exactly this Tennessee Titans offense and their running game is going to be able to produce in upcoming weeks. This is a far easier matchup. And the last time we saw Derrick Henry put up less than 30 rushing yards, which one of them was last night, prior to that was week 6 of 2019. When Marcus Mariota was the quarterback. We have very rarely seen this Tennessee Titans offense flub like this. I expect them to get back on track in an advantageous matchup. Moving on, we have Aaron Jones taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I understand it's a pretty difficult matchup. Tampa Bay has been really good in terms of stopping running backs. Really, over the last couple years, you haven't seen incredible performances. Even Jonathan Taylor last year had himself a decent performance against Tampa Bay, but nothing that you can just, ride home about being super excited about. The only running back last season that had over 100 rushing yards against them was Khalil Herbert. Like, just putting that in perspective is crazy. Nonetheless, Aaron Jones, we know he's going to play 58 to 60% of the offensive snap. We know he has the potential of getting a lot of receiving work. It's just a matter of whether or not those touchdowns are going to be there for him. Over the course of the season thus far, he has been ridiculous in terms of his yards per carry average. He's been ridiculous. He's been amongst the top of the running back position. Him and DeAndre Swift at the top in terms of yards per carry after contact. When you're able to just hit the hole, make contact, and continue to find success down the field, that keeps me very excited about this upcoming weekend's matchup. Even though it is a tough one, we know he has a nose for the end zone. We're just hoping that Aaron Rodgers can get them down there into the conversation. He scored 42 touchdowns in the last 47 games. I think Aaron Jones will be in a decent position to at least be a 10-point running back, if not even more, with the receiving work continuing to incline his overall production. Moving on, we have Leonard Fournette on the other end of this matchup. The Green Bay Packers really did struggle in terms of stopping the run the last 2 weeks. We saw Dalvin Cook in week 1 put up, 90 rushing yards. This last week, we saw an incredible performance out of David Montgomery of over 100 rushing yards on only 15 carries. Leonard Fournette, I understand, has mentioned that he was only playing on one leg against the New Orleans Saints because of that hamstring injury. But the thing that really bothers me isn't really his rushing production. It's the fact that he hasn't been getting a lot of work in the receiving game. Thus far this season, in the first 2 games of the year, he has only had 2 catches in both games. 13 of the 14 regular season games he played last year, he had 3 or more catches. The fact that Tom Brady is no longer targeting him in that capacity gives me an indication as to, Tom Brady doesn't want to pass him the ball because he knows he's injured. He doesn't want to put more strain on him. Otherwise, we know Tom Brady to be a quarterback that always gets his running backs, involved in the receiving game. Whether it was James White, whether it was Leonard Fournette, it does not matter. It could be Ronald Jones from a couple years ago. They continue to get those running backs involved. So as of right now, I'm hoping that injury isn't going to be a big deal, but this is an advantageous matchup for Leonard Fournette. So if he's at a full capacity, I expect him to play well. Moving on to Najee Harris, Thursday night matchup. Najee Harris last season, in the 2 games he took on the Cleveland Browns, had incredible performances. 19.5 fantasy points and a half PPR and 28.1. I know that 28.1 performance, one of them was in week 17 in which he broke out a huge run at the end of the game. Nonetheless, I expect Najee Harris to hopefully find the end zone. That is the biggest difference maker. He's getting the opportunity that he needs, whether it is on the ground or in the passing game from Mitchell Trubisky. It's just a matter of finding those ever elusive touchdowns. That's what he struggled with last year, only scoring 8 of them on the ground. Hopefully, they can get into a conversation where they can get down into the red zone and get this man the ball, because that's where he belongs. finding himself scoring touchdowns. All right, now that we've gone ahead and covered our top 12 running back rankings, let's go ahead and pop them up on screen. We have, of course, Jonathan Taylor all the way to Najee Harris. We've just talked about these guys, so take it as you will. Just wanted to show you guys, present these graphics as best as I can. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We can go ahead and change these as the week progresses if, in fact, we get more information regarding injuries or stuff like that. We know, of course, DeAndre Swift dealing with his ankle, Justin Herbert with Austin Eckler, whether or not he is going to be active, Leonard Fournette with his hamstring. These are all things that we're going to monitor as the week progresses. All right, let's go ahead and let's get into our RB2 conversation, beginning with Javonte Williams taking on the San Francisco 49ers. Listen, I think that the San Francisco 49ers are a pretty good run-stopping defense. This last weekend, they really did not allow anything to Rashad Penny, Kenneth Walker, or Travis Homer on the ground. But then again, the San Francisco 49ers really weren't tested in that regard. There were very minimal attempts from the Seattle Seahawks offense, but this upcoming week, they're going to be tested in that regard. Javonte Williams is going to come out there and, of course, have himself a lot of opportunity. This past week, he had 15 rushing attempts for 75 yards against the Houston Texans. It was an advantageous matchup, played himself 65% of the offensive snaps. But my biggest concern is whether or not he's going to find the end zone. Luckily, we did see him get opportunities. Unfortunately, he could have scored a touchdown, but Russell Wilson just really isn't getting the job done over there. At times, he was wide open, literally on the goal line, hands up. There was nobody within 5 yards of him. And then Russell Wilson decides to throw the ball 15 yards into the air at the back of the end zone, and nothing was done of it. So obviously, there is going to be a little bit of a chemistry issue as we progress. Hopefully, they'll begin to click sooner rather than later. But as of right now, I expect Javonte Williams to be the goal line back of this team, the primary running back, and of course have a receiving upside, which keeps him in this conversation. Moving on to David Montgomery. Like I mentioned just a bit ago, he had himself a great game against the Green Bay Packers. I mean, this is the kind of performances we want to see from David Montgomery. 15 carries for 122 yards and 8.1 yard per carry average, getting himself 2 catches out of the backfield. But my biggest concern isn't the fact that, the Houston Texans are a tough defense. They're absolutely not. This is a great matchup. My biggest concern is Justin Fields. In the last 2 games, he has only had 8 and 7 completions. So 15 completions in 2 games total is really just not going to work. Now, luckily for David Montgomery, he's playing 80% of the offensive snaps and getting majority of the rushing and receiving work out of this backfield, and his role is completely intact. But Justin Fields certainly does concern me because if he is not throwing the ball enough, defenses are not going to worry about, having to not stack the box. They'll stack the box and force Justin Fields to beat them, which is concerning for David Montgomery's upside. But luckily this week against Houston, should be fine. Moving on to James Robinson. Listen, coming off the Achilles, he doesn't look like the James Robinson of old. I can assure you that. When watching film, he looks like he's a step slower. I understand this, but he is still getting the job done. You look at his rookie highlights compared to what he's done in the last couple weeks, at least he's continuing to find the end zone, despite how inefficient he may be at times. They're putting him in positions to succeed, and that's pretty much all you need. It doesn't matter how washed you are as a running back, and I'm not saying he's washed in any capacity. I'm just saying he's not as good as he used to be, and, that kind of makes sense. That's what happens when you have an Achilles injury that ends your season. Nonetheless, they take on the Los Angeles Chargers. Their defense really hasn't been, at the top tier in terms of stopping the run. As of late, they really haven't been tested in that category much. Obviously, last week kind of lost the game, giving up a big run to Clyde Edwards at the end of that contest. But as of right now, in terms of the backfield distribution of Jacksonville, we have 37 total touches towards James Robinson and 18 towards Travis Etienne. That kind of defines what kind of backfield we're seeing here. It's a one-back kind of offense with James Robinson leading the pack. Moving on, we have Antonio Gibson as number 16, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles defense. Philadelphia has given up their fair share of points in terms of the running back position. Majority of that came in week 1. DeAndre Swift, Jamal Williams, both of them having great games. Last night, Dalvin Cook was not given any opportunity because Kirk Cousins had to throw the ball for the majority of the game and could not keep the ball within his own receiver's hands because he was throwing it to the other team consistently. That being said, let's talk about Washington now. They take on the Eagles. That defense may have looked a lot better than they actually are, but maybe we've just been fooled seeing, the Detroit Lions put up a lot of points on them in week 1 and thinking they're not as great. Either way, I expected a lot of, upside from Antonio Gibson this last week. He didn't find it. And that in itself gives me concern. He had himself 14 rushing attempts for a second consecutive week here, but was only able to put up 28 rushing yards. Luckily found the, end zone against Detroit, but he should have had himself a 25-point game. The fact that he's beginning to lose more and more receiving work to J.D. McKissic. J.D. McKissic accounted for 7 targets, 7 catches, 54 receiving yards, while, Antonio Gibson only had himself 2 catches for 13. That in itself beginning to worry me. That's why he kind of is trickling down our board. Luckily, it's a decent matchup, and he's still getting rushing opportunity, which keeps him into the RB2 conversation. Moving on, we have Jeff Wilson Jr. Besides the fact that Elijah Mitchell, Trey Lance, and now Tyrion Davis-Price are all injured, I mean, this just opens up so much more opportunity for Jeff Wilson to be the primary starting back of this team. In the last 9 games that he has been the primary RB1 of this team, 2020 through 2022, he has been averaging 13.93 half PPR fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, averaging over 17 touches per game and 2.78 targets per game. We have seen him be very successful in this offense, and with Jimmy G under center, I expect this offense to just be as good as they have been and run the ball even more with Jeff Wilson, which gives him that much more opportunity. He's a must-start going forward within this offense. If for those of you who were able to pick him up, congratulations, you've got yourself a pretty solid RB2 until Elijah Mitchell returns. Moving on to Darrell Williams. Now, Darrell Williams could be here or James Conner. Depends who's going to be the starting primary back for this team. But let's just go ahead and say Darrell Williams does end up being the starter and James Conner misses a week. Even in that regard, I expect the Arizona Cardinals to be able to score against the Los Angeles Rams. I mean, the Rams couldn't even stop the Atlanta Falcons from having a comeback on them. The score was literally 28-3, and yeah, we saw a lot of work from that Atlanta defense come back. But I think this is a good matchup, purely because of the fact that we've seen running back success against the Los Angeles Rams from James Conner last year. James Conner put up 19.6 and 29.0 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Rams defense in the 2 regular season matchups that they had against them. I know that the Rams defense has been pretty good as of late, but the main contributor for James Conner finding that success was receiving work and touchdowns, scoring 4 touchdowns in those 2 games. We know how much upside an Arizona starting running back has, especially on the goal line. I expect Darrell Williams to find a lot of value this week as a potential free agent pickup off your waivers and immediately being started in the matchup. Moving on to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You know what was crazy? I was kind of sifting through and I found that Clyde Edwards, as of right now, is the number 5 overall running back in a half PPR, averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game. And even if we were to take away his 2 receiving touchdowns this year, he would still be the number 18 overall back. Now, we have him as our number 19 purely out of respect for the idea that he's going to be the primary back. Even though this is a rotation, we know Jerick McKinnon, Isaiah Pacheco, they're going to continue to get work. But as long as Clyde Edwards-Helaire is in the conversation of getting himself 10 to 12 touches per game, we expect him to still be a valuable prospect because of the association he has with this offense and the potential touchdown upside he will have every single week. I know the Colts matchup has seemed as a difficult one, but that defense without Shaq Leonard in the middle of their defense as their primary linebacker really just hasn't looked the same over the last couple weeks. I think Clyde Edwards has himself another good week here as our number 19. Moving on to number 20, Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders has himself an incredible matchup taking on the Washington Commanders. Again, Miles Sanders has pretty much kind of established already that he is the RB1 of this team. There is no question. That's pretty much what he did all of last season, except for when he was out with injuries. In the first 2 weeks of the season, we have seen him have 15 touches and 20 touches. That in itself is fantastic. The biggest elusive factor in this offense is the fact that he might not get a touchdown every single week because Jalen Hurts is running those in. Again, we've only seen Miles Sanders only have 2 goal line rushing attempts this year, while of course we've seen 1 from Kenneth Gainwell, 1 from Boston Scott, and the rest going in the direction of Jalen Hurts. That all being said, behind the best offensive line in the league, averaging over 5 yards per carry once again, I expect Miles Sanders to continue his success against Washington this week. Moving on to A.J. Dillon. Listen, this is an offense that somehow, someway is giving their RB2 18 rushing attempts and 3 targets that led to 1 catch. He's had 15 and 19 touches in the last 2 weeks. That kind of opportunity for an RB2. Now you take on one of the toughest run-stopping defenses. We're going to have to downgrade A.J. Dillon to an extent, but he's still an RB2 because of the association with this offense and his ability to be a goal line back and find success in that manner. We have seen running backs in the last 2 weeks find success against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. Zeke averaged over 5 yards per carry, and even Mark Ingram of all running backs was averaging 6 yards per carry last week. It's just a matter of being able to get those first downs and continue drives. A.J. Dillon's going to be a valuable option. Just a little bit of a downgrade in comparison to weeks past. Moving on to Josh Jacobs, our number 22, taking on the Tennessee Titans. The only thing that really gives me excitement about Josh Jacobs is the fact that Tennessee really hasn't played well this year, and that he is the only running back in this backfield that is getting rushing attempts. Purely. Zamir White, I think, had 1 rushing attempt. The week prior, Brandon Bolden maybe had 1. Outside of that, it is all Josh Jacobs. And it's just a matter of whether he finds the end zone as to whether his overall upside is met. Now, they went down to the 1-yard line, and unfortunately, they did that little trick play where Davante Adams motions down and they throw it to him. Immediately, he walks into the end zone. If you hand that off to Josh Jacobs, he becomes a 15-point fantasy point running back. We're not complaining in any regard, but that's what we expect. We expect him to have the upside of being, 15-plus points, but at the base floor of an 8 to 10 player and a half PPR scoring format, considering he is not being given too much work in the receiving game. So as of right now, I think it's a good matchup. I think that touchdown could very easily be found. That's why we have him as our number 22, playing 71% of the snaps. Pretty good number in comparison to seasons past. Moving on to Darrell Henderson, our number 23. I think Darrell Henderson is most likely going to move up in my rankings as the week progresses. I have watched the Los Angeles Rams game. Again, I'm a Rams fan. I'm going to watch that one again first and foremost, just to kind of get an idea. But in the first half, the Rams were playing incredibly. 28-3 was the score. And that's funny because they were taking on the Falcons, and that number is quite synonymous with them considering their Super Bowl trials and tribulations. But as of right now, we saw Darrell Henderson in that second half completely evaporate. And they went ahead and they gave Cam Akers all the touches. Literally, Cam Akers had 12, I think, of his 14 rushing attempts in that second half, had himself a couple of his targets there too. Darrell Henderson got all of his work in the first half, and they gave Cam Akers the garbage time. So in my opinion, Darrell Henderson is still going to be the primary back, and if that's going to be the case against the Arizona Cardinals defense, I expect them to find success once again. He was able to be the goal line back of this team and rush for a touchdown. Gives me more hope going forward. He's our number 23, probably on the rise. Moving on to Cordero Patterson, our number 24, taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Listen, if in fact they can get into a run-heavy game script, Cordero Patterson is going to be extremely valuable. We know that he's going to get himself his 10 rushing attempts. He has receiving upside. Outside, whether it's in the slot, out wide, out of the backfield, it doesn't matter. Even if Tyler Algier is coming in and taking 10 rushing attempts away from him, we know that Cordero Patterson is the primary running back. I think the Seattle Seahawks matchup in itself, because it is more of a neutral matchup, we don't expect the Seattle Seahawks to take a massive lead early that forces the Atlanta Falcons to have to pass for a majority of the second half. This leads me to believe that this is going to be a team that's going to continue to run the ball early and often in this game. I mean, just putting it in perspective, this team has had 47 running back rushing attempts in the last 2 weeks and 18 quarterback rushing attempts. They want to run the ball more than just about anybody in the league. And if they can get into a position to do so, they'll be using Cordero Patterson in a premium this week. Now, before we move on to our RB3 conversation, I want to go ahead and show you guys our RB2s here from Javonte Williams to Cordero Patterson. Again, this RB2 position is really where your weeks are won and lost. If these guys can jump into that RB1 conversation in a given week because of receiving upside, touchdown upside, they are going to be the biggest difference makers on a weekly basis. Because you know that you have to start your studs. But these are the guys that really do win or lose our weeks. And we're hoping, I mean, for a majority of them, they've been pretty good thus far this season. We're just hoping that consistency is intact. Either way, we're going to go ahead and move on and begin our RB3 conversation. Moving on to Damien Harris, our number 25. Damien Harris did go down with an injury late in that game, but he did tell a reporter in the locker room after the game that he's fine. He said, "Look at me, I'm fine. We're good to go." Okay, that's awesome to hear. He played, only 39.71% of the offensive snaps. Again, 40%. We talked about it this offseason. That's all he plays. He plays 40%, he gets his touches, and we're hoping for touchdown upside. If he does not score a touchdown, he is not going to be more than 10 fantasy points. That is just the reality of it. If he ever gets there, it's because receiving work somehow evolves. But to be honest, he had 2 catches on 2 targets, while Ramondre Stevenson had 1 catch on 2 targets. So maybe, just maybe, Damien Harris gets more involved as a 3-down back with Ty Montgomery out. Either way, taking on the Baltimore Ravens, we have seen him found success against this defense in seasons past. I think the Patriots will be up to task in terms of offensively, but stopping the Baltimore Ravens is going to be tough, which may make this a negative game script, which may force Damien Harris kind of out of the conversation, considering his receiving work isn't as high upside. Moving on to Kareem Hunt, our number 26. It is crazy as to how many touches Kareem Hunt gets out of the backfield. Had himself 15 touches this last weekend. Again, 30 thus far this season. So 15 in each game. As a backup running back, it's crazy to see that he's getting that kind of utilization. But considering his efficiency, there's no complaints. Averaging 4.5 yards per carry against the Jets, fantastic. Playing 46% of the offensive snaps. If it wasn't for the fact that Nick Chubb had all 3 of those rushing touchdowns, maybe, just maybe, we would have had ourselves a 14-point fantasy week from Kareem Hunt. he's always going to be in that conversation. He's going to get the touches. This is a team that wants to run the ball. In a short week, against a defense that, in my opinion, still cannot stop the run, especially with TJ Watt out now, we're in a position where Kareem Hunt should be a player that we're going after and starting in our flex positions. Moving on to our number 27, we have Dameon Pierce. It is crazy to see the 180 shift from the Houston Texans, playing, Rex Burkhead in 70% of the offensive snaps in week 1 against Indianapolis, to now in week 2, Rex Burkhead literally getting 0 rushing attempts. That was a crazy thing to see. Now they take on the Chicago Bears. Of course, we saw the Green Bay Packers tear them apart. And even though the Houston Texans rushing attack isn't going to be as effective, we still saw a lot of effectiveness from Dameon Pierce. 15 rushing attempts, 69 rushing yards, a 4.6 yard per carry average. 8.2 fantasy points, playing 66% of the offensive snaps. If Dameon Pierce ever gets into the conversation of being the goal line back of this team and having consistent opportunities and falling into the end zone, could very easily be a top 24 running back on a weekly basis. It's just the fact that he's associated with this offense and behind a pretty bad offensive line that kind of moves him down the board. Otherwise, the opportunities are beginning to kind of shift in his direction and be there on a weekly basis. It's only a matter of time until he breaks into that top 24 on a weekly basis as a ranked running back. Moving on, we have J.K. Dobbins as our number 28. Speaking of, it's only a matter of time. J.K. Dobbins hopefully is going to, get back to being the starting running back of this team. He has been at a full capacity and been practicing at a full designation over the last week. Now, the fact that he didn't play this last week against the Miami Dolphins isn't really a surprise. This is pretty much what the New York Giants should have done with Saquon Barkley last year. Do not let him play for the first month. But hopefully, J.K. Dobbins returns because they truly do need a RB to lead this backfield. Kenyon Drake, Justice Hill, Mike Davis should all be cut immediately. They are not playing well in any capacity. And I understand the offensive line has not been incredible, but eventually J.K. Dobbins is going to be back. And when he does return, hopefully this week, they're going to give him all the touches in this backfield because they can, because nobody else really deserves any touches. Lamar is going to get his rushing attempts, and that's always going to be, successful, especially against the New England Patriots, who have had a very difficult time stopping Lamar Jackson offenses over the last couple of years. If J.K. Dobbins is back, he's in my lineup. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott, man, he's such a tricky position right now, considering how much success Tony Pollard found last week, the matchup that he's faced, but luckily he has a positive matchup this week against the New York Giants. In the last 7 games that Ezekiel Elliott has taken on the New York Giants, this is going all the way back to 2018. In 6 of those games, he has scored a rushing touchdown. Overall, he has scored 8 touchdowns in the last 7 contests against the New York Giants. He played 67% of the offensive snaps, had himself 15 rushing attempts, 2 targets, 1 catch, but still not hyper efficient in those opportunities. Tony Pollard, on the other hand, was great. But I'm hoping Zeke is going to be that goal line back and get himself a rushing touchdown to continue the streak. If he's not able to, obviously he's probably outside of the top 30. But speaking of our number 30, I want to talk about Tony Pollard because I do think Tony Pollard and the rushing attempt he was given on the goal line isn't something that is going to be, a one and done. I know he earned it by getting down to the 1 yard line, but the fact that they gave him the opportunity, he got into the end zone, he was really efficient with his running opportunity and got himself 7 targets, 4 catches out of this backfield, while Zeke only had 1 catch on 2 targets. It leads me to believe that Tony Pollard is beginning to take over the job. And if that's going to be the case, bye-bye Zeke. Tony Pollard will continue to rise up our boards, but for right now, we want to wait and see what exactly the opportunity is going to look like on a consistent basis. Of course, week 1, we saw him with 10 touches, but if that's going to continue to rise in a positive way, of course, Tony Pollard could be a fantastic fantasy option. Moving on to Mark Ingram, our number 31. My expectation is that Alvin Kamara doesn't play. If he does, then he's starting for your team regardless. So if you're listening to this and you're an Alvin Kamara fantasy manager, you want him on your team and starting if he's available. But if he's not, Mark Ingram is a great replacement against the Carolina Panthers, a very favorable matchup. And Mark Ingram himself has been a great running back for this team. Last week was averaging 6 yards per carry against Tampa Bay. He is a capable receiving back. We have seen that year over year. So it's purely a matter of a fantastic matchup and giving a older running back the ball, sure. But if he's able to be efficient with those, get into the end zone, could be a fantastic fantasy option for us. Moving on to Michael Carter. Michael Carter is still the primary running back for this team. It is no question in my mind. 61% of the offensive snaps. Yes, he wasn't able to score a touchdown or have that huge upside that he had in week 1, but still 5 targets, 5 catches, 27 receiving yards, 7 attempts for 23 yards. Really wasn't fantastic, but still, if he's going to get touches, that's all we can ask for. If he's going to be the starting running back of this team, of course, we want him in our lineup. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals. Interestingly enough, the Jets did beat the Cincinnati Bengals last year with Mike White at quarterback Joe Flacco looks a lot better. This may just be a competitive matchup where Michael Carter is getting a lot of opportunity, especially on the ground and through the air. Moving on to Rashad Penny. I know Rashad Penny was a complete no-show this last week, having himself literally 6 rushing attempts for 15 yards, a 2.5 yard per carry average, and then disappearing after that, considering Kenneth Walker was more involved. We saw Travis Homer in the receiving game dominate there. That is all concerning, but I think the matchup against the Atlanta Falcons is favorable enough to where Rashad Penny can be utilized on the ground in a neutral game script matchup where they're not getting blown out. They can go ahead and run the ball for majority of this game, find success, and when in fact Rashad Penny kind of finds his groove, he's going to break out a couple runs here, hopefully find himself in the end zone. Moving on to Ramondre Stevenson. Even though Ramondre Stevenson outsnapped Damien Harris by a pretty wide margin, playing 62% of the offensive snaps, they did play a couple snaps together. In fact, the rushing touchdown from Damien Harris, both these running backs were lined up in the backfield. Very easily could have been handed off to Ramondre Stevenson. So you never know. Either way, the fact that he played 62% of the offensive snaps, had himself 10 total touches, but only 1 reception, that is concerning. We thought this was going to be a guy that could very easily be a 3-down back, get himself 5 catches out of this backfield, be relevant in the receiving game, but that was not going to be the case. Hopefully this upcoming week against Baltimore, we see more utilization in that regard, but if he's going to be on the field more and more, he's going to have fantasy upside. Was averaging over, 4 yards per carry. That's all you could really ask for. He just needs the receiving work because the touchdowns will probably be going in the direction of Damien Harris. Moving on to Breece Hall. Listen, Breece Hall had himself a good game. 12.5 fantasy points is fantastic, but 1 target, 1 catch, 10 yards, and a touchdown. That pretty much saved his week. Yes, he had 50 rushing yards on 7 attempts, which is, incredible. But unless this team is going to be in a game script where they can consistently run the ball and give Breece Hall more opportunity, which I believe they should be doing already. Breece Hall should have already been the starting running back, but they've gone ahead and opted towards Michael Carter. The fact that Joe Flacco's thrown the ball 103 times in the last 2 games leads me to believe that they're most likely not going to be running the ball consistently this week against Cincinnati. Even though Cincinnati has not looked great offensively and it may be a lower scoring event, I still think Breece Hall just doesn't get enough opportunity to make him a relevant option unless he is scoring touchdowns, which again is relatively rare for the running back position as of right now. Moving on, we have Travis Etienne as our number 36, closing out today's video. We have Travis Etienne in this position because he's really not getting much utilization. Again, we've talked about it. The fact that James Robinson, has 37 touches while Travis Etienne has 18 in the first 2 games. I understand that Travis Etienne has been hyper efficient, averaging over 5 yards per carry, averaging over 10 yards per reception. Those are incredible numbers. But if they're not going to give him more opportunities, we can't trust him outside of this lower end RB3, potential replaceable bench option going into this upcoming week. All right, we're going to go ahead and throw up our final of our top 36 rankings from Damien Harris to Travis Etienne. Again, do not forget rankings are subject to change. We will have a Sunday morning live stream, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I assure you this time it'll work in order to kind of set it up and get it ready to go. Anyway, this pretty much covers today's video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. Be sure to subscribe if you have not yet already. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the wide receiver position, giving you guys our top 36 wide receiver rankings. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today when you sign up. And when you make a first-time deposit using the code, you'll get a first-time deposit match up to $100. Check out their Pick'ems game. Draft some Thursday Night Rumble teams. Their battle royales every weekend. A lot of fun to be had there. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.